Okay, right, we'll just start with some questions about the report. In terms of evidence, I mean, you're talking about a lack of evidence base, and considering this has been quite a sort of pertinent issue within Scottish society for many decades, one, why do you think there's been such a lack of evidence, and two, how do we now take that forward?
I suppose the overwhelming impression you get from having done this work is that there's a fear factor in dealing with sectarianism, which we actually would like to get rid of. And that fear factor cuts two ways. Some people wanting to say, look, this is not an issue and you're going to make it an issue. And other people wanting to jump on anybody naming it and making it so sensational that actually you can't deal with it anymore. And I think evidence is our way through that particular morass. We need to now dig up the facts as this. Now, some of that's quantitative evidence, and there is a degree of quantitative evidence which says that certainly it's no longer the factor it was, for example, in people getting jobs and so on. And that's good news. But we are still picking up a lot of qualitative evidence, which is that this has impact on people in communities, this has impact on people in their leisure lives, this has impact on people in their sense of who they are in their communities, in playgrounds for young people. It's very formative in their identity. And so what we need to now do is track the quantitative evidence, keep that going, make sure that it's not avoided and dropping off the plate because it's unfashionable, and at the qualitative level trying to build the evidence so that people can say this is what we're talking about.
Now, you talked there about a fear factor amongst certain people when discussing sectarian attitudes and sectarian behaviour and addressing it. Now, I see that you were quoted this morning saying that you were a bit disappointed at the lack of engagement with the two football clubs, Celtic and Rangers. I mean, do you think that there is a fear factor amongst football organisations when it comes to looking at this and addressing it?
I think a lot of organisations have their origins in history when sectarianism was a real factor, and so it was built into the formative lives of these organisations. Things may have changed, and nevertheless things linger on in the way that those origins were made. And certainly football seems to have, in Scotland, picked up this virus of them and us. Them and us is there everywhere, but football has been one of the ways in which that was represented, in both good ways in the sense that this was part of identity, but also then in negative ways where it becomes a matter of hostility. And what I suppose people have a fear about is we'll just brand people as sectarian and say to them, go away. That's a legitimate fear. That's not what we're about. What we're actually about saying, though, is look, where sectarianism happens and where it's actually having impacts on people, it is really important that organisations which have their roots in this kind of life take it seriously and do what they can to make sure that it doesn't have these impacts, particularly where those are violent, where there's about hatred, where they're actually encouraging a kind of bullying culture and giving permission for that. And that's not to say that that's just a Rangers and Celtic issue. It's across the board. It's in junior football. And I think one of the risks we run in raising this issue is everybody runs to Rangers and Celtic. We don't want that to happen. We want it to be seen in a much more general context. But we can't possibly talk about it without also acknowledging that in the stadiums every week this needs to be dealt with and actually acknowledged.
How are you going to engage football organisations?
Well, I suppose we want to engage everybody. We want to engage football, we want to engage churches, and it's not just football which hasn't stepped up to the plate here. I think for me, everybody has kind of believed maybe the best way to deal with it is not to deal with it, or it's too hard, let's let this one out of the box. If we have a shift that we want to make, it is we want to move from thinking that not dealing with it's the best way to deal with it to saying, look, let's get the evidence and deal with it in practical terms in the normal way you would deal with anything else, and let's get it into the normal box. I think for the football clubs, we have to say to them, this is part of being a future modern club within the European environment, and so there's actually an incentive for you to make sure this works properly. I think that there are ways in which it could be a very creative engagement, so I think we need to explore what that's going to look like, so that it's about a representation of football which isn't about hatred but is about actually what football clubs now are, which is very, very important areas of people's social lives and very important parts of the cultural life of Scotland.
Now, you've made it very clear within your report that you don't see the need for any new legislation. Do you feel that the last piece of sectarian legislation was necessary, the most recent piece?
Well, actually, specifically on the Offensive Behaviour Act, I think, to be absolutely clear, that was bracketed out of what we were doing because it's a kind of a parallel track. We were the supplement to that. And I think that what is happening there is it's being separately evaluated, and I think that will be important to do to make sure, is it effective, is it working, and is it the wrong way to go about it or the right way to go about it. Our task was to look at initially how would you engage people in community around this, because I think it's part of a general recognition that no single piece of legislation is going to work here, because it's not that kind of a thing. Sectarianism is not just something that's happening on a one-off basis in the football club. It's actually an attitude of mind, it's a way of doing things, it's a set of assumptions, it builds from small things into big things and so on, or it sits around, isn't important for one moment and then suddenly kicks back into life. So legislation, in our view, is important in the same way that legislation is important to deal with equalities and human rights and so on. All that's already on the books. So it's not a question of an absence of specific legislation. It is a question of actually supplementing that, complementing that, even driving that with a change in culture. How do we change the culture around this? And that, we think, is best done through community activity, through the way in which politicians don't play games with this issue, through the way in which people who are responsible for key areas of life actually develop plans to proactively deal with it. And that is, in the long term, how you're going to deal with this, because sectarianism isn't a light switch. It's something which is part of the way in which we've done things, usually attached to other things, and we need complicated responses to it.
Now, the Action on Sectarianism website, which was launched a couple of months ago, has separate sections on the website for different groups of people within society. So if I can sort of quickly ask you what you feel would work in terms of targeting these particular groups. I mean, if we take children, for example, I mean, where would you see the way forward in terms of that group?
Well, in terms of children, first of all, part of what we're actually advising the government on is on piloting a set of initiatives in a whole lot of areas, and youth and children are one of the areas we're interested in. In terms of children, I think the areas where we have been most interested and which we will try to look at are in the curriculum. Are there ways to actually look at this issue, how it impacts historically, and also allow children to deal with it? We heard very good examples of schools projects, of people with teacher-led projects, of work in Glasgow with the Divided City project, which actually allows young people to name this issue, deal with it, and actually face it together. So those are the kind of things on the curriculum. I think if we could encourage schools to look at ways of working together to ensure that where issues of sides or where local issues emerge between schools are actually being dealt with and don't take on that sectarian tinge, then it would be important to look at that in terms of the way in which schools do their business. Youth work, I think, is also very important, because this isn't just an area when you're in school, it's actually something which people are carrying out in informal culture. You're in gangs, they're in groups, they're in, young people are, so we would like to see that dealt with there. I think also, when finally, it's making sure that when dealing with the equalities issues, sectarianism isn't off the plate. It's not we deal with them all except that one. It's we deal with them all including that one, and it's part of the mix in which every young person in Scotland growing up, by the time they're 17, 18, knows what these issues are, knows how they want to express themselves in terms of it, and knows the limits in terms of behaviour.
And having a look at the challenges when we look at adults in Scotland, because by the time you get to adulthood, your views, if you have sectarian attitudes, they are probably pretty entrenched. Where do you see the way forward for that?
Well, I think this is where actually a lot of this is about relationships, a lot of it's about generosity. We would like to see opportunities for people in institutions which adults participate in, whether those are community institutions, whether those are church-based institutions, whether those are sporting institutions, whether those are even actually institutions of cultural importance such as parading institutions, that there are opportunities within those to engage in a plural context. The world is becoming more and more plural. These are not just issues of sectarianism, they're issues about how we deal with difference in such a way that it's not about discrimination and exclusion, not about suspicion and segregation, and not about giving permission for violence. So in some sense or other, what we're looking for is opportunities to humanise the other, to make sure that it's part of everyday routine, and that organisations are not constructed on an exclusive basis but actually are built to include that as part of everyday life, because that'll make the biggest difference. When you can't keep sectarian or any other kind of attitudes simply because there's too many other examples in your life of people or situations where it's contradicted by your own experience, and that's the kind of thing we would like to encourage.
Now, one of the key findings of your report centred around civic leadership in Scotland. What would be your message? What support would you like to see offered in terms of the decision makers throughout Scotland, but also organisations, community organisations, youth work organisations? What support would you like to see?
Well, I suppose we have, as a body, tried to do this on two fronts. There's a kind of a messaging front, which is the kind of permission that is given by people in formal responsibility in churches to begin to actually acknowledge historical realities and also how that's shaped the way we relate, and maybe build what we do in the future slightly differently. In schools, to actually give permission to see the breaking down of any kind of hostility around difference as a priority and something which you would put into the curriculum and put into the activity, so that no school child comes to the end without having engaged on this topic in a really meaningful way. That's one side of it. That's the messaging side. There's also a practical side. The Scottish Government has made available money for organisations and groups to actually pioneer different ways of doing this. Mainstreaming means that, for example, in community life there are programmes and activities where people do these kind of things. We build the skill base. People don't shy away from it because they don't know what to do. We can direct them to materials and give them examples of people who can mentor them in that kind of work. And then maybe the third level, at civic level, is that Glasgow City Council, for example, has pioneered Sense Over Sectarianism, which is actually beginning to name this as a real issue and begin to look at practical responses. That's the kind of model we'd like to see expanded, instead of it being handled and kept off the media agenda and, you know, people having to use huge amounts of effort to kind of keep things off the table, which we heard small examples of. I think it's better to move towards the model which Sense Over Sectarianism are pioneering here, which is that councils would see this as part of their ordinary community outreach. They wouldn't be frightened of it. They'd be able to have that as one of the tools in the box which they can attach. So it's a messaging issue, it's a practical issue, and it's a responsibility taking issue as part of your responsibility to your civic community. And if we can get that mainstreamed in the next few years, then I think you have a chance of this actually changing through behaviour and through attitudes, and just through the fact that people aren't frightened of it anymore.
And finally, as we go forward, how would you see the website Action on Sectarianism fitting in and being utilised?
Well, I think actually web-based activity is becoming so central to everyday life that, first of all, we absolutely have to have a presence on the web. Number two, the possibility of building a web base creates a centre of excellence which everybody can access, and that includes young people or people who are interested in this topic just out of their own interest, but it also includes people looking for signposting to professional advice, there's no point in continually reinventing the wheel here. We can actually build good practice through websites. I think Action on Sectarianism is a really good idea now that we have the web not as a marginal part of our activity but as a core part of activity. It's where people go to find the latest and best information. So it is important that we keep it updated. We're constantly revising it for best practice, and probably surveying at various points, if we can get the opportunity to do that, its usefulness and where we can actually take it. But I don't think you can do this kind of work now educationally without a website.
Oh, that's great.
All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Is that all right?